After coming back from work, my husband hugged me and froze. He pointed at my shirt and said, "What is this?" He looked pale. "What is what?" I asked. "Don't you notice?" Soon, I noticed it too, and my jaw dropped. 12 days later, his mother watched a video and started screaming. My name is Hannah Briggs, and I'm 31 years old. Our suburban home, with its tidy lawn and friendly wave neighbors, was supposed to be our sanctuary. It was the place Mark, my husband, and I were building a life, away from the noise of the city and the complications of our 20s. But our sanctuary had a flaw, a built-in vulnerability hidden under a kitschy ceramic frog next to the front door. It was a spare key, and Linda, my mother-in-law, had the only other one. She didn't use it for emergencies. She used it for inspections. I'd come home from work to find little changes, subtle shifts in our domestic landscape that screamed her presence. A stack of mail I'd left on the entryway table would be sorted and piled neatly. The dishwasher would be humming, reloaded because I'd apparently done it wrong. She'd leave passive-aggressive notes on the granite countertop, written in a loopy, perfectly controlled script. "Saw your low on paper towels," one would read, with a single jumbo roll placed next to it like some kind of sad offering. Mark called it helpful, I called it surveillance. He saw a loving mother. I saw a woman who never quite accepted that her son had his own home, his own wife, his own way of folding the towels. Her organizing of our pantry wasn't about efficiency. It was a silent judgment on my own, a constant reminder that in her eyes I was failing. The key under that frog was a symbol of trust to Mark, but to me it felt like a leash, keeping us tethered to her approval. And always, the last thing I'd see after one of her unannounced visits was the flash of her perfectly manicured nails, always painted a glossy blood red, as she waved goodbye from her pristine sedan. The night it all started, Mark came home looking tired from a long week. He dropped his briefcase by the door and pulled me into a hug, burying his face in my hair. It was our ritual, a silent shedding of the workday. But this time, it lasted only a second. He stiffened, his arms going rigid around me. He pulled back, not gently, and his expression shifted from weary affection to confusion, and then to a cold, sharp suspicion that I'd never seen on his face before. "What is that smell?" he asked. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth. I lifted the collar of my t-shirt to my nose and inhaled. It was a sharp, biting men's cologne, not warm or woodsy like Mark's, but aggressive and cheap, the kind that clings to the air in a crowded bar. It wasn't his, it wasn't mine. My blood ran cold, a sudden, icy dread washing over me. I knew instantly. "Your mom was here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I tried to keep it steady. "She texted this morning. Said she was coming by to check the dryer vent for lint buildup." Mark's face was a mask of doubt. His loyalty, I could see it warring in his eyes, was being stretched thin between the woman he married and the woman who raised him. It was easier, simpler to believe his wife had a secret than to believe his mother was a saboteur. He didn't say the word cheating, but he didn't have to. It hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating, poisoning the sanctuary we tried to build. The quiet peace of our home shattered. I looked at his conflicted face and realized pleading wouldn't work. My word against hers was a battle I'd already lost. My goal was suddenly crystal clear, forged in the chill of that moment. I wasn't just going to prove my innocence, I was going to prove her guilt. The fight was no longer optional. The next morning, the silence in the house was a physical weight. Mark was polite, pouring me coffee, passing the sugar, but his movements were stiff and his eyes avoided mine. He was a million miles away, lost in a fog of suspicion his mother had so expertly rolled into our home. The cologne scent still lingered faintly in the hallway, a ghostly reminder of the accusation hanging between us. In that strained quiet, I started to notice other things, small tells I had previously dismissed as her harmless meddling. Now they seemed like clues in a crime scene. The decorative throw pillows on the couch, the ones I always fluffed and stood on their corners, were chopped in the middle with a sharp karate chop crease, a decorating style she loved and I hated. A novel on my nightstand, which I was halfway through, had a bookmark placed 20 pages ahead of where I'd stopped reading. My favorite mug, a handmade ceramic one from a local artist that I always left on the drying rack, was back in the cupboard, pushed to the very back behind 3 others I rarely used. It felt like living with a ghost who followed me around, silently correcting my life, convinced my way of doing things was fundamentally wrong. These weren't just quirks, they were territorial markings. Linda was constantly reestablishing her presence in our home, reminding me that she could enter at will, that no space was truly mine. My first tactic, telling Mark the plain, unvarnished truth, had failed miserably. His loyalty was split, and her lifetime of goodwill outweighed my few years of marriage. I needed something he couldn't deny, something visceral and absolute. I needed proof. The plan began to form in my mind, a cold, clear structure rising from the ashes of my anger. I went down to the basement and dug through a box of old electronics until I found it. My old smartphone, the one I'd replaced 2 years ago. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks, but the camera on the back was still perfect. Online, I ordered a tiny, flexible tripod and a high-capacity power bank, the kind used for camping trips, enough to keep the phone recording for a full day or more. When they arrived the next day, I set up my surveillance station. I positioned the phone on the top shelf of our bedroom bookshelf, tucking it between a heavy photo album and a stack of old paperbacks. The lens was a tiny black dot, peeking out with a clear, unobstructed view of the entire room, including the bed, the closet doors, and the entryway. I downloaded an app that would let me stream the video feed live to my current phone, turning it into a pocket-sized security monitor. The technology was simple, but the intent felt heavy, a line I knew I was about to cross. The trap was ready, now I just needed the bait. I had to give her a reason to come back, a pretense of helpfulness she couldn't resist. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over her contact photo, a smiling, perfectly coiffed Linda. I typed out the message, carefully crafting each word in her own language. Hey Linda. I'm heading out for a long lunch with a friend tomorrow. The weather forecast says rain, and I think I might have left the upstairs window open a crack. Could you possibly pop in and close it for me? You'd be a lifesaver, I added a little smiley face at the end. It was the perfect lure, a simple task, a hint of my own forgetfulness, an open invitation to come and save the day. The trap was set, now all I had to do was wait. The next day, I left for my long lunch. I drove 2 blocks away to a small cafe with reliable Wi-Fi, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and anticipation. I ordered a black coffee I had no intention of drinking and propped my phone against the sugar dispenser. The live feed from my old phone was grainy but clear. Our bedroom looked peaceful, bathed in the late morning sun. For an hour, nothing happened. I watched dust motes dance in the light, my heart hammering against my ribs with every passing car. I started to think maybe she wouldn't come. Maybe I was wrong, paranoid. Then, at exactly 11:14 a.m., the feed from the security camera I had installed in the main hallway showed the front door opening. Linda stepped inside, carrying her oversized handbag. She didn't look around, didn't call out. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who owned the place. She walked straight up the stairs and into our bedroom, right into the camera's frame. She didn't even glance at the window I'd asked her to check. Her mission was something else entirely. She went straight for my closet. My breath hitched. I watched, mesmerized, as she unzipped her purse and pulled out a cheap-looking, lacy black lingerie set. It still had the tags on it. With practiced ease, she tucked it deep into my sweater drawer underneath a pile of my winter clothes. Next, she pulled out a tube of bright red lipstick. She walked over to the bed, uncapped it, and deliberately smeared a waxy streak on the pillowcase on Mark's side. Then came the final touch. She produced a small atomizer bottle and sprayed the same acrid, cheap cologne from the other night, misting it over the curtains and onto my side of the comforter. A cold wave of nausea washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated vindication. This was no misunderstanding. This wasn't overzealous helping. This was a calculated, premeditated attack. Just when I thought it was over, she delivered the finishing touch, the one detail that elevated her scheme from malicious to monstrous. She reached back into her purse and pulled out an empty, crinkled condom wrapper. My stomach dropped. She knelt down, her movements precise, and slid it under the edge of the nightstand on Mark's side of the bed. It wasn't completely hidden, but it wasn't obvious either. It was placed to be found by someone looking for something, a final, damning piece of fabricated evidence. The sheer evil of it took my breath away. Before she left the room, she did one last thing. She stood in front of the full-length mirror on the closet door and practiced her performance. She arranged her face into a mask of sorrowful discovery, her lower lip trembling slightly. I watched horrified as she mouthed the words, her voice too low for the phone's microphone to pick up, but her lips formed them clearly. "Oh, Mark, I'm so sorry," she was rehearsing. She was scripting the moment she would break her own son's heart, presenting him with the evidence of his wife's infidelity. A tiny, triumphant smile flickered across her face as she checked her work one last time. Satisfied, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving a web of lies in her wake. I fumbled with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the button to save the recording. The game had changed. This wasn't just a fight for my marriage anymore, this was a war. That evening, I didn't greet Mark at the door with accusations or desperate explanations. The time for words was over. When he came into the living room, I was sitting on the couch, my face calm. I just looked at him and said, "There's something you need to see." I used the app on my phone to play the video on our smart television. I didn't narrate. I didn't add commentary, I just let the silent, time-stamped footage fill the screen, a silent movie of his mother's betrayal. I didn't watch the television, I watched him. I saw his expression shift from confusion to sharp disbelief as he saw his mother walk into our bedroom. When she pulled the lingerie from her handbag and shoved it into my drawer, his brow furrowed. When she uncapped the lipstick and smeared it on his own pillow, a muscle in his jaw began to twitch violently. But the condom wrapper was the final blow. I saw the moment the reality of it landed. He didn't make a sound. He just put his head in his hands, his broad shoulders slumping in defeat. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint, tinny sound of his mother's rehearsed murmurs coming from the TV speakers as she practiced her lines in the mirror. He sat like that for a long time after the video ended. When he finally lifted his head and looked at me, his eyes were filled with a profound shame and a deep, soul-crushing regret. "Hannah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry." It was more than an apology for his doubt, it was an apology for his blindness. In that moment, I felt the ground beneath us become solid again. We were a team. A few minutes later, Mark stood up and walked outside without a word. I watched him through the living room window as he strode to the front porch, knelt down, and picked up the heavy ceramic frog. He reached underneath, retrieved the spare key, and slipped it into his pocket. He came back inside, his face set like stone, and dropped the key on the kitchen counter. It landed with a definitive metallic clink. "That's over," he said, his voice low and firm. The sound of that key hitting the counter was the sound of a lock turning, of a boundary being fortified. Later that night, he sat on the edge of our bed and called Linda. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but it was enough. "Mom," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you are not to enter our house again unless one of us invites you in. Call first." "The key is gone." There was a long, silent pause as she presumably protested on the other end. "It's not up for discussion," he said finally. "This is our home, those are the rules now." He hung up the phone and let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked exhausted but also relieved, like a man who had just performed a long overdue surgery. A boundary had finally been drawn in clear, bright lines. I thought this might be the end of it. I was so naive. It was just the end of the beginning. Linda's direct access to our home was gone, so she pivoted. If she couldn't control the narrative inside our walls, she would control it outside. She went public. It started subtly with vague, pity-seeking posts in the neighborhood Facebook group. So sad when you see a good man not being respected in his own home, she wrote one evening. Praying for my family. Immediately, comments poured in from her friends, the other matriarchs of the community, offering their support. You're such a good mother, Linda, one wrote. Thinking of you, another added. Each comment was a small, sharp pinprick against my skin. From there, she escalated. At company picnics and community events, she would pull Mark's colleagues aside, her face a mask of concern. She was worried about him, she'd say. He seemed so stressed lately, so unhappy. She never mentioned me by name, but she didn't have to. She was an artist of insinuation, planting seeds of doubt not in our home, but in the very community we lived in. She was methodically isolating us, painting me as a problem and herself as a long-suffering saint. I realized then that this was so much bigger than I had assumed. It wasn't just about her wanting to control our household. It was about her wanting to maintain absolute control over Mark's life, and I was the primary obstacle. The stakes were no longer just about the sanctity of my marriage, they were about our entire life here. The real blow came a week later, and it was aimed directly at my heart. I was a guidance counselor at the local high school, a job I adored. It was more than a paycheck, it was my vocation. One Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Davison, my principal, called me into his office. He was a kind, fatherly man, but today he looked deeply uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes as I sat down. He cleared his throat. Hannah, he began, I've received a couple of calls from parents. He told me 2 mothers had called to complain. They'd heard unsettling rumors about my moral character. They didn't offer specifics, just vague, poisonous slander suggesting I was an unfit role model for their children. I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew with absolute certainty who was behind it. Linda had weaponized neighborhood gossip and aimed it squarely at my livelihood. She had found my new vulnerability. It was a brilliant, cruel move. She wasn't just trying to break up my marriage anymore. She was trying to break me, to dismantle my life piece by piece until there was nothing left. The pressure was immense. My career, my financial stability, my professional reputation, it was all on the line. She had turned our private war into a public execution. My first reaction was pure, hot panic. The thought of losing my job, of being ostracized from a career I had worked so hard to build, was terrifying. But then, a cold, hard anger took over. I wasn't going to be a passive victim in her twisted drama. I was done reacting. It was time to build a fortress. I started documenting everything. On my laptop, I created a new, dedicated folder on a secure cloud drive protected with a long, complicated password. It was my digital war room. I went back through the neighborhood Facebook group and took screenshots of every one of Linda's vague, passive-aggressive posts, along with all the sycophantic comments from her friends. I saved the original, unedited video of her planting the evidence in 3 separate places: the cloud, an external hard drive, and a thumb drive I kept in my purse. I started a time-stamped log in a spreadsheet, noting every strange interaction, every piece of gossip that made its way back to me through a concerned colleague or a friend. Mark was fully on my side now. The last of his denial burned away. He started forwarding me text messages from his mom, conversations filled with leading questions and feigned concern about my well-being. How is poor Hannah holding up? I heard there's some trouble at her school. I do hope she's all right. Each message was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building. This wasn't just about a single video anymore. This was about building an airtight case, piece by piece. I was gathering the receipts, preparing for a war I now knew I couldn't afford to lose. One night late, my phone buzzed. It was Bate, Mark's sister. She sounded nervous, her voice hushed as if she were afraid of being overheard. Hannah, it's Bate. I heard what Mom is doing, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. The things she's saying about you to people, the rumors, it's happening again. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Again? What do you mean again? Bate let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry years of frustration. Hannah, you need to know about Tara. Tara Nolan, Mark's ex-girlfriend, was a name I knew but a story I didn't. Their relationship had ended a year or so before I met Mark. He never liked talking about it, just said it was a messy breakup and he was glad to be out of it. Now, Bate was filling in the blanks. 5 years ago, Linda had done the exact same thing to Tara. It wasn't about cologne or lingerie then, it was about money and alcohol. Linda had started whispers that Tara had a drinking problem, that she was irresponsible with money, that she was cheating on Mark emotionally with an old friend. She had methodically and successfully poisoned the well, turning Mark and the rest of the family against her with 1,000 tiny lies. Mark, younger and more trusting of his mother then, had believed her. It was a major factor in their breakup. This was the revelation that changed everything. It was the first hard proof that I wasn't just dealing with a meddling mother-in-law having some kind of strange breakdown. This was a pattern. This was a pathological playbook she had run before and won. I wasn't her first victim. Bates' voice was thick with guilt as she continued. She convinced us all, Hannah. She's so good at playing the concerned mother. By the time I started to realize Mom was the one causing all the problems, it was too late. Tara was gone, and Mark wouldn't listen to a word against Mom. Linda had an established, field-tested strategy for systematically dismantling any woman she didn't approve of, any woman who threatened her position as the primary female influence in her son's life. Suddenly, my fight wasn't just for my marriage or my job, it was for the truth of what she had done to Tara, too. The threat to my career felt more urgent, more real. Linda had already destroyed one relationship. She would have no problem destroying my professional life. She had no limits. The idea that I could handle this privately, that we could just draw a boundary and move on, evaporated. A private solution would never work with someone so dedicated to destruction. It was no longer enough to protect my home. I had to expose her completely. The universe seemed to agree. The very next day, I was outside watering the hydrangeas in my front garden when Zoe Carter, my teenage neighbor, walked over from her house across the street. She was a sweet, quiet kid, a student at the high school where I worked. She shuffled her feet, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Briggs," she said, twisting a strand of her long hair. "I don't want to be a gossip or anything, but I saw something weird last week." She explained that she'd been sitting on her porch and had seen Linda's car pull up to our house on the day I'd set the trap. And then she delivered the final, perfect piece of the puzzle. She was carrying a shopping bag, Zoe said, one of those fancy ones from La Belle Lingerie, that expensive shop in the downtown mall. That was it. That was the missing link. A third-party witness, an observation that corroborated the timeline, the video evidence, and the props Linda had used in her little production. Zoe had seen her bringing the weapon to the crime scene. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I thanked her, telling her how helpful she'd been, my mind racing. I now had the irrefutable video, the historical pattern from Bate, and a credible witness. The case against Linda Briggs wasn't just compelling anymore. It was locked tight. The information from Bate about Tara Nolan was the catalyst. It was the truth that flipped my entire strategy on its head. I looked at the folder of evidence on my computer and realized I wasn't fighting a difficult mother-in-law anymore. I was fighting a serial saboteur. Any thought I had of keeping this private, of protecting Mark's feelings or trying to salvage some semblance of a family relationship, was gone. That was playing defense, and I had been losing badly. It was time to play offense. My original plan was simple, almost laughably so in hindsight. Show the video to Mark, change the locks, and hope Linda would get the message and back off. That plan hadn't just failed. It had failed spectacularly, triggering a massive escalation. The new plan had to be bigger. It couldn't just be about protecting my home, it had to be about dismantling her primary weapon, her reputation. Linda operated under the cover of being a caring, helpful, respected member of the community. It was the source of all her power. It allowed her to whisper her poison into willing ears. I was going to burn that image to the ground. When I laid it all out for Mark, he didn't hesitate. Seeing the pattern, hearing what his own sister confirmed about Tara had finally broken through the last remnants of his denial. His face was grim, but his eyes were clear. "Do what you have to do, Hannah," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I've got your back all the way." My irreversible choice was to take the fight public, but on my own terms. I spent an entire evening locked in my home office becoming a video editor. I was meticulous, watching the footage over and over, my anger giving way to a cold, surgical focus. I used a simple editing program to blur our faces whenever they appeared in reflections. I blurred the house number visible through the window and any family photos on the walls that could identify us. I left the timestamp from the camera feed untouched in the corner of the screen, a silent, objective witness. I focused the narrative on her hands with those blood-red nails pulling cheap lingerie from an expensive handbag. Her hands gripping a tube of lipstick and smearing it like a wound across a clean pillowcase. Her hands sliding that empty condom wrapper into the shadows. I added simple white text captions that appeared on the screen, providing stark, emotionless context. "When your mother-in-law has a key to your house, then, and she uses it to help, and finally, by trying to frame you for cheating." I chose a generic royalty-free instrumental track, something with a low, ominous hum that built a sense of creeping dread. The final video was a 90-second, completely anonymized montage of pure, calculated malice. Pressing upload would be crossing a line. It would be an act of war against a family member, a decision I could never take back. And I was perfectly okay with that. I sat there for a long moment, the mouse pointer hovering over the button, and I consciously accepted the personal cost. A normal relationship with Linda would be impossible forever. Holidays would be a frozen tundra of resentment. Some extended family members, the ones who only saw her public face, might side with her and cut us off. But the cost of doing nothing was infinitely higher. My marriage, my career, and my own sanity. My goal had been completely restated, reforged into something bolder and much riskier. It was no longer prove my innocence to my husband. The new goal was expose Linda's tactics to the world so she can never use them to hurt anyone again. This wasn't just revenge, it was a scorched earth policy. It was a firewall to protect myself and to get some small measure of justice for Tara. I created 2 new anonymous accounts on the biggest video sharing and social media platforms with generic usernames and no profile pictures. With Mark sitting next to me in the quiet office, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder, I clicked the button. The video uploaded, it was done. Then I leaned back in my chair and we watched the view counter start to tick upwards. 1, 2, 7, 15, the first drops of a rainstorm I had unleashed upon the world. The upload felt like a flat, small thing at first, just a click, but then the world answered. The counter jumped, slow at first, then like a dam opening. 28,000 views by day 3, then 1.5 million by day 6. Comments came in like a river, people telling their own stories, strangers thanking me, others asking advice. The internet is a strange jury, ruthless, quick, merciless with cheaters, but also generous to victims. For the first time since I'd hit send, I felt a small, fierce satisfaction. I'd taken the one thing she used like armor, her image, and I'd cracked it. I thought that would be enough to stop her. I was wrong. She couldn't attack the video directly. Anonymous accounts are slippery, impossible to pin publicly, so she did the next cruelest thing. She turned to people who could wield institutional power. She found the 2 parents who had already called my principal and recruited a third, someone with kids at the same school who trusted her like gospel. Linda has built a network for years. She knew which buttons to push, which fearful phrases to whisper. The new meeting wasn't a casual call, it was organized, formal, timed to hit me when the video was hottest online. They demanded a sit-down with the principal and the superintendent. They came prepared with specific, fabricated stories this time, claims they'd seen me telling students to hide relationships from their parents, claims of inappropriate guidance given in a one-on-one conversation. Their voices were steady, rehearsed. It was clear someone had primed them. That moment when I got the official email asking me to come in felt like falling through glass. I sat at my kitchen table, the laptop screen bright and accusatory, and my hands went numb. Mark paced, kicked at the baseboard, then held my shoulders like an anchor. "We'll get through it," he said, but his jaw was tight and I could hear the strain in his voice. We both knew how fragile reputation is in a small town. A sliver of rumor, a formal complaint, and people who never met you can decide to believe the worst. The principal's office smelled of old coffee and file folders. He tried to be kind, made sympathetic noises, but the room felt like a courtroom. "Legally, I have to do this," he said, using that dry, cautious language administrators use when they want to avoid liability. "Pending the outcome of the investigation, we have to put you on paid administrative leave." Paid. That little word was supposed to comfort me, but it felt like salt. My desk emptied into cardboard boxes while colleagues looked on with faces that shifted between pity and suspicion. Someone I'd shared lesson plans and casserole recipes with smiled too quickly and said, "If there's anything I can do," as if they meant anything at all. Leaving the school that day felt like being shuttered out of my life. The staff room, usually loud with the small joys and small cruelties of teaching life, had gone quiet when I passed. Kids I'd advised for years gave me polite waves in the hallway that were laced with a new wariness. That's the thing about being accused publicly. The people who used to be your anchors become tentative, as if proximity might stain them. My office, once full of sticky notes and plants, now stood empty, a cardboard box where a year's worth of plans lived. I had to carry home a box of personal mugs and a framed certificate, as if those things could explain me. The administrative leave did what Linda intended. It made her lies look like they had teeth. People in town who hadn't seen the video started to say, "Well, I heard she was suspended," and that became shorthand for guilt. The rumor had muscle now, official action had given it legitimacy. Her next move was cruelty wrapped in concern. She called Mark, scene-setter voice on, and played the part of the grieving mother. "I'm so worried about poor Hannah," she said, not bothering to hide the edge of triumph that threaded through her words. She knew how to make victimhood sound persuasive. Every time she phoned, I felt the walls move in a little. Mark tried to be my fortress. He paced, he called people, he snapped at callers, but his anger bled into helplessness. The thing that frightened me most was the realization that I had options that all looked bad. If I admitted to being the video's author to defend my job, I'd look vindictive and petty, like someone who'd weaponized public shame. If I stayed anonymous and watched the investigation play out, I risked losing everything while people whispered that suspension meant wrongdoing. It was a trap with no clean exit. At night, I woke up thinking of Tara, of Bates' quiet confession, of how long Linda had been building a casebook of lies. The viral video had bought me momentum, but it hadn't broken her. She'd adjusted and moved the fight to the places she could win. Then came the Homeowners Association newsletter, a thin, glossy sheet that usually announced garage sales and pool hours. My heart dropped when I read her name at the top as chair of the Safety and Security Committee. The headline blared about a new neighborhood safety watch program she was championing. It sounded harmless on the surface, keys held for emergencies, a community service. But I knew Linda. Her help wasn't about safety, it was access. The more I read, the colder my skin grew. The proposed plan called for the committee to hold spare keys for residents, to be used in case of lockouts, pets left inside, or leaks. It was dressed up in legal-sounding banter about convenience and emergency response. Underneath that veneer, it meant institutionalizing what she'd already been doing in our household, giving herself sanctioned permission to walk into anyone's home. I could see the force of it in my mind, the keys piled in a cabinet under a committee chair's control, a rubber stamp of authority across what used to be private thresholds. She could make a network of access, normalizing intrusion as community service, and then cite it as reason for her concern about other people's homes. If she succeeded, her credibility would be fortified by official process. Linda's small lies would become policy. My chest felt tight, a drum of panic beating against my ribs. This wasn't just personal anymore. It put every neighbor at risk of being reassessed by her moral compass. That evening, I spread the newsletter out on the kitchen island like a crime scene. The paper rustled under my fingertips. Mark stood beside me, his hand finding mine, fingers squeezing. "We can't let her do this," he said, voice small. "If she gets keys to the neighborhood, she becomes untouchable." I pressed my forehead against the cool paper and felt the grain of the print like an accusation. She hadn't just attacked my life. She was trying to build an apparatus that would let her do it to anyone. I sat there thinking fast. The video had taught me one thing: evidence is persuasive in a way accusations never are. People trust documents. People trust timestamps. If I was going to stop this, I had to turn Linda's plan back on itself. She wanted a narrative of community good. I needed to make very plain, very public the way she used helpfulness as a tool. The decision sank into me like a stone. I'd taken her down once anonymously. Now the stakes had grown. If she succeeded at the homeowners association level, it would strengthen every lie she'd ever told and add a bureaucratic layer to her power. I could not let that happen. My next move would have to be public, direct, and damning. No blurred faces, no anonymity. It was dangerous and there was no going back, but the quiet of our home and the safety of our block demanded it. The HOA proposal removed my last safe option, like someone pulling the rug out from under me. I had been clinging to the idea that the anonymous video would ripen a public reckoning while I rode out the storm at work. Maybe my job would survive the noise long enough for facts to catch up. Maybe people would see her pattern and the complaints would fade, but the newsletter showed me I'd miscalculated. If Linda turned her personal access into a neighborhood policy, she would be building herself a shield of legitimacy. The spare key under my ceramic frog would stop being a private violation and become a single act in a much larger system she controlled. That thought made my chest ache. It wasn't just me anymore. This could affect every house on our block. She wanted a key to every door with a smile and a form. She'd learned how to translate meddling into community service language, how to make intrusion sound like safety. That was worse than the original betrayal. At least when it was just our house, I could change locks and keep the camera. If she got authority across the neighborhood, she'd be able to point to a policy and say, "See, I was just helping." People trust committees. People trust leaders in neat blazers. I wasn't willing to gamble my neighbor's privacy on whether anonymous views and internet anger would be enough to stop her. Mark sat at the kitchen island while I read the newsletter again and again. He rubbed his forehead until it left a crescent of white against his skin. "We can't let her do this," he said. It was obvious, but hearing him say it made the plan sharpen. The video had given us momentum, but institutions were her playing field. I had to bring the evidence not to the court of strangers online, but to the rooms where decisions were made. The game changed from exposing a lie to stopping an institutional lie from being born. I had one honest, ugly choice: either come forward and own what I'd done, which would look vindictive, or take the evidence to people with power and let them decide without my face attached to it. There wasn't a clean way to do it. If I stayed anonymous and did nothing, she would win. If I revealed myself, the gossip would scream that I'd weaponized humiliation. I felt the pressure in my palms like the heat from a stove. The stakes were bigger than pride. This wasn't just about marriage or a job now. It was about stopping a person who'd built rules around her need for access. I wrote emails that night. My hands trembled as I typed each address into the message field for the other 6 homeowners association board members. I didn't want drama, I wanted facts. I attached the full, unedited 12-minute video file, the raw footage that showed every motion, every placement, the condom wrapper sliding under the nightstand. I included timestamp notes and the date the footage was recorded. My message was short, clinical. "Board members," I wrote, "before you vote on the Neighborhood Safety Watch key-holding proposal, I believe you should see this footage of the committee chair, Linda Briggs, using a spare key she already had at my home on date. No flourish, no accusation, just the plain offer of evidence." I didn't copy Mark on the emails. I didn't sign my name. It felt like sneaking into a church to ring the bell without lighting the candle. I hovered over the send button and thought of Tara, of Bates' voice when she'd said, "She did the same thing." I thought of every parent who might hand their keys to someone they trusted. I clicked send, the messages whooshed away into the network. There was no taking that back. The plan was dangerous because it took the truth into a formal place where policy was discussed and votes were cast. If they looked at the footage, they couldn't call it a vendetta. They had to act on what they saw or else be complicit. I knew the risk. If the board ignored it, I'd lose my anonymity and have given them nothing. If they acted but Linda rallied the neighborhood, I'd have invited a social reckoning onto my family. But doing nothing when she was trying to systematize intrusion felt like cowardice. I chose the mess I could live with, the fight in rooms with meeting minutes and signatures over the slow, private erosion of people's homes. I shut my laptop, breathed in, and tried to sleep. The hum of the house felt different now, like the moment before a storm breaks. My phone rang the next afternoon, and I could tell from the number on the screen it was the superintendent. My stomach folded into itself. "They moved the meeting up," he said in a voice that tried to be gentle and failed. "It's in an hour. They want to talk to you. Can you come now?" I felt the seconds fall away, each one heavier than the last. 1 hour. I had to gather a defense against accusations that weren't just whispers anymore. They were specific and dressed like concern. I drove to the school in a sort of daze. The world outside the car window blurred into streaks of color. In the parking lot, my hands were slick on the steering wheel. I told myself to breathe, to remember the evidence backed me, that I had files and timestamps and witnesses. But those things live differently in a room full of authority figures and concerned parents. In a meeting, words and tone can drown out a video file. I kept imagining their practiced faces, the way lines were rehearsed to land with authority. The meeting itself felt like being on stage for a play I hadn't rehearsed. 3 parents sat at the table like a united front. They had prepared stories that felt measured and precise, accounts of private conversations with students, a tale about me encouraging kids to defy parents' rules, another claiming I'd given a student advice to hide a relationship. The claims were specific enough to sting but slippery enough to be impossible to disprove quickly. They spoke in steady, calm voices that made me think of people reciting lines they'd been coached on. Linda wasn't in the room, but her presence was the outline behind their words. The superintendent and the principal leaned forward, their faces giving nothing away. The entire time I had an image in my head. The anonymous video with its blurred faces and stark captions, the raw footage I'd also sent to the homeowners association, the timestamps on the files. None of that seemed to fit the rhythm these parents set. When I tried to answer, my voice didn't feel like mine. I told the truth, plainly. I explained what I knew about the rumors about being targeted in the neighborhood about the video. I brought up the timing of the calls and the pattern I'd uncovered about Linda. The superintendent's expression didn't change. People in authority learn how to be neutral to keep from being sued or dragged into politics. That neutral face felt like an indifferent referee watching 2 boxers trade blows. At the end of the meeting, the superintendent folded his hands and said something I hadn't thought he would. "Given the nature of these complaints and in the interest of the students, we have to take this seriously. We need time to investigate." He stopped short of firing me, but he didn't need to. The words landed like a verdict in slow motion. I was given 24 hours, an administrative purgatory where a decision would hang in the air. Walking out of that office, cardboard box in my hands, felt like being left at the edge of a cliff. The corridor was full of faces that tried to look sympathetic but became rehearsed gestures. A colleague offered me a hug that felt distant. Students passed in the hallway and glanced my way with curiosity that quickly turned to caution. The rumor had teeth now because there was process attached to it. The anonymous video that had rallied strangers across the internet suddenly seemed like a small thing compared to the slow machinery of claims and investigations. I drove home with the box of my things on the passenger seat and felt like I'd been emptied of who I was in those rooms that mattered. I didn't call Mark. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to walk into my house without him waiting with the look that mixes fear and anger. Maybe I wanted to touch ground on my own, The house felt different, every sound exaggerated. The hum of the refrigerator was too loud. The kettle in the kitchen sounded like a siren. I sat on the couch and let the silence wrap around me. It was the worst kind of loneliness, surrounded by things that knew me and people who had decided they didn't. The video counter on my phone kept climbing in the background, indifferent to my life. A million strangers could be nodding and sending messages of support, but in the school boardroom, in that official meeting, they had no weight. I thought about Tara and how quiet her goodbye must have been. I thought about how Linda had likely crafted a future where someone else took over our lives with the softest of hands. My hands shook when I picked up my cloud hard drive and stared at the file names as if the saved footage could hold me together. For the first time since I'd set the camera in the bookshelf, doubt wormed its way alongside determination. The plan had bought time and attention, but it had also opened doors I couldn't close. I felt small, squeezed between a viral video and the slow, public process that could take everything I had worked for. Just when I felt like I was slipping under, Bates showed up at my door with a bottle of cheap red and a look that said she wasn't leaving until I didn't have to handle this alone. She hugged me like a person who'd been keeping a secret too long, like someone who'd been waiting for permission to be brave. We sat at my kitchen table with the bottle between us and 2 glasses. She told me she'd done something that afternoon, something small but huge. She'd played the anonymous video for Mom. Bate had taken Linda to her house under the pretense of needing help picking out a dress for a work event. Once there, she'd put the phone on the coffee table and started the video. At first, Linda watched like someone watching a crime show, curious, annoyed, sure it would be some mistake. Then Bate said Linda screamed. It was a raw, surprising sound, half anger, half panic. She insisted the clip was fake, that someone had doctored her hands, that this was a deep fake. Bate told me she'd seen the flicker of recognition under that mask, an eye widen, a hand go to her mouth. It wasn't proof, Bate said, but it was a crack. Before Bate left, my phone buzzed. An email from the Homeowners Association president, Miss Briggs, we have reviewed the footage you submitted. We will be discussing it in a closed session before the main meeting tomorrow night. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. The message was short and neutral, but it felt like oxygen. The footage I'd sent, the raw, longer file, was being seen by people with actual power to act. It didn't guarantee anything. It didn't mean victory. It meant someone was finally looking where I'd been pointing. For the first time in weeks, something fragile and real shifted toward hope. The night of the Homeowners Association meeting, I sat in the back of the community clubhouse with Mark's hand tight around mine. The room smelled like cheap coffee and lemon cleaner. Linda stood at the podium in one of those knit blazers that tried to be motherly and official at once, smiling like someone about to win a bake sale. She began to speak about neighborly responsibility and emergency access, and for a heartbeat I could see how she'd sold it to people: safety, convenience, peace of mind. Then the association president, Mrs. Gable, cut through the air like a blade. She was small and precise and had the kind of voice you listened to even if you disagreed. Before we discuss new business, she said, there is a serious matter regarding the conduct of a board member. Her words landed heavy and deliberate. I felt every eye in the room slide toward Linda. They didn't play the footage for the full crowd. They didn't have to. The board had watched the raw file in a closed session and taken a vote. Mrs. Gable read it out loud, her paper steady in her hands. A vote was taken in closed session. The board has voted 6-1 to remove Linda Briggs from her role as chair of the Safety and Security Committee, effective immediately. There was a sound in the room, part gasp, part embarrassed whisper. Then she added, and the board is rejecting the proposed Neighborhood Safety Watch key-holding program. Our members' privacy is not negotiable. That last sentence landed like a gavel. The color drained from Linda's face. For a moment, she looked like a person who'd been exposed for a trick. Her public confidence flickered and fell away. She tried to speak, to call it a misunderstanding, but the board kept going as if they had already listened to the evidence and chosen. The room had shifted. The structure she'd built for herself was collapsing in slow, civil motions that felt final. Watching her then, the way the mask slid was a strange, quiet thing. She stood at the podium, all practiced sympathy gone, and her mouth opened and closed around words that sounded small and suddenly sharp. I saw the old motif snap. Her neat nails, the smile practiced for neighborhood events, the posture of someone used to being trusted. Her shield was gone. She scanned the room and her eyes landed on me. For a second, everything else blurred. I've never been good at public displays, but I met her gaze and felt nothing dramatic happen. No cheering, no triumphant fist pump, just the steady knowledge that truth, carefully gathered, had done what shouting never could. She made a sound, part animal, part human, and then grabbed her purse. There was a frantic quality in the way she moved, like someone fleeing a scene she suddenly knew she couldn't control. She practically ran from the room. People who'd once nodded at her sympathetic posts were sitting in lines, whispering, looking at their hands. There was no dramatic speech from my side, no public spectacle. The board's vote and their rejection of the key plan were the work. They'd seen the footage in private and chosen to remove her authority. That, more than anything, was the thing that undid her. The morning after felt oddly ordinary. My phone rang early and it was the superintendent. The 3 parents who had made the formal complaints had withdrawn them without explanation. My administrative leave was lifted. The first person I saw at work gave me a cautious smile and then, later, an apology for the awkwardness. Small things unrolled into normal. My office returned to its slightly messy, comforting self, sticky notes reclaiming the corkboard. Students waved at me in hallways and some stopped to ask if I was okay. It felt like a quiet reclaiming of territory. At home, the difference was deeper. The house breathed differently. The silence was not the tight, braced quiet I'd lived with for months, but a real, comfortable hush. Mark and I moved through the rooms without measuring our steps. We cooked dinner without second-guessing whose spices should be where. He started leaving little notes, small invitations that read walk or movie, and I would roll my eyes and answer in pen. Our bed felt like ours. Our pillows stayed where we put them. The cost of what we won was clear. Mark's relationship with his mother was a broken thing. There were phone calls that went unanswered, and when Linda showed up at family events now, the air thickened into something brittle. Holidays became a series of polite 2-hour gatherings at Bates where a corner chair always remained empty for someone who would not look me in the eye. It hurt. I don't pretend it didn't. Winning didn't feel like triumph so much as necessary damage control. We ran into her once at the grocery store. She stood in the cereal aisle while we pushed our cart past. Her eyes met ours for a fraction of a second, and then she just abandoned her cart and walked out. There was an awkwardness in the dropped box of cornflakes and the ripple of conversation that followed. People who knew us smiled the way neighbors do, careful, not wanting to make a scene. It was all very small, and that made it real. The frog is still under our welcome mat, but there's only dirt under it now. The spare key is gone. The camera is in a drawer. The footage is backed up in 3 places, a silent insurance policy that I hope I never have to use again. Mark reached across the porch one Saturday morning, squeezed my hand and said, "It feels like our house now." Just ours? The sun was low, the coffee warm in our mugs, and for the first time in a long time I believed him. I'm not sharing this to revel in revenge. I'm sharing it because there are clever people who will use kindness as a cover to take away your peace. If you're in a place where someone is rewriting the story of your life, keep records, trust your instincts, and if you can, find people like Bait, quiet allies who will choose you. If this story touched something in you, share your experience below. And if you want more stories about pushing back and reclaiming what's yours, subscribe for the next one.